Thanks to the organizers and to all of you for being here. This really is the right time to discuss decisions, and I want to be very focused on decisions that are that will be taken for good or worse in the next few weeks. Decisions that will completely reshape what we understand as Central Europe. When we talk about the crises that we discussed here, we are really talking about the reunification of Central Europe, of Vienna and Czernivtsi, of Prague and Kiev. For what is Central Europe? Clearly Poland, but also Ukraine. Clearly the Baltic states, but also Moldova. Clearly the Czech Republic, but also Austria and Germany. So what we have at the moment is actually a division among those Central European countries about the future of their region. In a city on the edge of Central Europe, if you want, in Zurich, in 1946, a heroic leader, and we talked about heroism, a heroic leader looked at what he considered in 1946 the tragedy of Europe, and he had a remedy. He looked around at a time when there were 18 million displaced persons in Germany alone, when there were devastated cities from Minsk to Kiev to Warsaw to Cologne, when there were hate and unsolvable status problems in Europe that seemed to doom this continent. And this heroic leader, Winston Churchill, said that there is a remedy to overcome all of this and make Europeans, and I quote, as free and happy as Switzerland. And that remedy, talking about Switzerland, it just meant the absence of war, the persistence of institution, the stability of democracy. And that remedy, as he famously called it in Zurich, was to reunite, recreate the fabric of Europe and create a kind of United States of Europe. And a few years later, it was French leaders who then took this idea and with this image of the fabric and stitches had the ingenious idea of stitching Europe together slowly, carefully. These were not young idealists. These were leaders who had experienced tragedy, prison, occupation. They stitched Europe back together, starting with coal and steel in 1950, and then extending it to what they called the European Economic Community. And the central idea of this document in 1957 that was signed in Rome was, and I quote, eliminate the barriers which divide Europe, not just the six, Europe. And I sometimes hear that European integration is something that is possible in good times, but not in bad. That it is not really about dealing with war and tragedy and disaster. But just remind you that in 1957, while these leaders were discussing the European Economic Community, there was war in this economic community. Torture, executions, fighting for the French parts of Algeria were considered part of France. The Battle of Algiers was happening while these leaders were discussing how to stitch Europe together through economic integration. In fact, the Fourth Republic, the great leaders who had created Europe, they fought one war after the other. First in Indochina and then 8 years in Algeria. Europe was created against the background of war as devastating as what we see in Ukraine today. And they were not the only ones. The Dutch in Indonesia, the British executing Cypriots in the war against British colonialism in Cyprus, the Belgians fighting their war in Congo. No, these were not peaceful leaders. But of all their efforts at those times, what survived was not the French Empire, not even the French Fourth Republic, and not the Warsaw Pact. What survived was this European Economic Community. Because it was stitched together by interests, by a simple vision created by men with a strong sense of the tragic, like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman, who'd seen borders change, wars being fought, and Jean Monnet himself spent much of his political career during 2 world wars procuring weapons so that the Allies would win the war. Now, going back to Central Europe in 2022, we have really 3 visions. Well, we have the Ukrainian-Moldovan vision. We know what Ukrainian leaders have asked us, Foreign Minister Kuleba, President Zelensky. Then we have the vision of those countries that signed a letter on 28th of February, just 4 days after the war started. Central Europeans from the Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Bulgaria, who said, we are asking, against the background of this war, that the Ukrainian and Moldovan request, they talked at that time mainly about Ukraine, for candidate status, is granted right away. So those Central Europeans realized that for them it was an existential question that Central Europe's reunification doesn't stop, as we've heard, at the Polish-Ukrainian border, doesn't stop at the Prut dividing Romania from Moldova. Now, candidate status, we've discussed it, is a symbol. But if we don't give it, it's also a symbol, and a devastating one. If European leaders cannot agree now, when the vast majority of the public in Europe empathizes, sympathizes, supports Ukraine, and European leaders don't have the courage to give candidate status now, that is a strong message to the Kremlin. And it is a devastating one. And don't go for conditional candidate status. Don't go for all the things and formulations that have been created for the Balkans. I think the Ukrainians would do well to reject it. I think they will. But it is a symbol. We don't build Europe with symbols. That's the lesson of Jean Monnet and Schuman and Spack and the founders of Europe. That's what worked. It wasn't the symbols, it wasn't the talking shops. It was the interests. And the interest in this vision from the Treaty of Rome eliminate the barriers which divide Europe. It took a while. But in the end, those barriers were divided. The borders became invisible between France and Germany, between Germany and Poland. We will have to work to make the border between Poland and Ukraine and between Romania and Moldova as invisible in the next few years. And the way to do that is to focus on the technical with a political vision. To focus on the 4 freedoms. I sometimes hear that European integration is all that technical stuff, all this box checking, all these discussions on laws and regulations, but what is behind it